and then we'll move forward. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, the seal of vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Right, so we learned last week that a set of 7 is actually a heptad, and a heptad is a period of 7, which is a period of 7 years. So when they say 7s, or in some translations you'll read weeks, it's actually a period of 7 years. So Daniel is getting a 490-year prophecy from Gabriel directly, the angel Gabriel, and it's concerning the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem, because he realizes that the exile is about to be over and they're about to be let back to go rebuild Jerusalem. And he's praying to God for that. And because he's praying to God, God sends Gabriel to give him this prophecy. Okay, so he's prophesying about a 490-year period that pertains to the Jews and the city of Jerusalem. So that's where we're at, right? And then at the end of these 490 years, sin will be finally ended. All wickedness will be atoned for. It'll bring in everlasting righteousness, and it will seal up all vision and prophecy to anoint the most holy place. So the underlying portion there, that's also the same end that we saw in chapter 2. If you remember when the rock snatched the statue, right? That was it formed into this everlastingly righteous mountain from God, and it consumed the whole world, and it would never be destroyed. So that's the same prophecy there in chapter 2. It's also the same prophecy from, I believe it was chapter 7, the 4 beasts, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, chapter 7, the 4 beasts. If you remember, Daniel, he saw these 4 different beasts get stirred up out of the sea. Each one represented a Gentile kingdom, with the 4th beast being just a beast that didn't have an animal description. And then on its head, it had 10 horns, and then a little horn, which represented the Antichrist. And then Daniel saw the Son of Man before God receiving that like blessing off to go form this everlasting kingdom. And then Daniel saw how that Son of Man came down and threw the Antichrist into an eternal fire, and like basically brought on the millennial kingdom. Right, so the same thing is happening here. Right, so my version of it, and the reason why I did my version, including the text there and verse 24, and then you'll see a green block that has my version. So in order to continuously interpret all the verses of this prophecy, I have like a running my version, which is like the green block. So that's when we deduce all the different facts and all the different translations of the Hebrew root words. I put it all captured in the green block. So as we break down the following verses, that green block will get longer and longer until we have the whole prophecy translated appropriately and in a way that all of us can understand. Right? So verse 24 is saying, Daniel, God has decided to set apart a 490-year period specifically for the Israelites in the city of Jerusalem, where at the end of it, God will put an end to sin, bring on everlasting righteousness by fulfilling all prophecy through the Messiah. All right, take us to the next slide. Okay, and then this is the last slide we hit on the past Sunday. So chapter 9 refers to someone or something as the following: the Holy of Holies, the Most Holy, the Anointed One, the Anointed Priest, the Prince, etc. And then it talks about how at the end of this, sin will be ended, wickedness will be atoned for, everlasting righteousness will be brought in. And the question is, well, what are we talking about with the Holy of Holies, the Most Holy, this Anointed One, this Anointed Prince, this Anointed Ruler? Who is this figure? And I argue that it has to be the Messiah, because only the Messiah can end sin. Only the Messiah can atone for wickedness. Only the Messiah can bring in a period of everlasting righteousness. Okay, so this figure that we're talking about in chapter 9, this Anointed One, or the Most Holy of Holies, is the Messiah, which is Jesus Christ. Okay, next slide. And also go back on one last piece. One last one real fast. All right, so in the underlying portion of the red block here, I have God has already provided Daniel with messianic knowledge. This wasn't new information. So if you remember the chapter 2 prophecy, the Messiah was in there. The Messiah was the rock. That wasn't cut out by man's hand, but it was cut out by God's hand and came down and smashed all the Gentile kingdoms, right? And then that same prophecy was repeated again in chapter 7. But this time, instead of a statue, it was beasts, right? Except this time, Daniel saw the Messiah. He saw the Messiah before God. He saw the Messiah come down and deliver justice to the Antichrist, etc. Right? So the key takeaway here is this isn't new information. Following the same pattern of all the previous prophecies, you have a prophecy, the next one adds more detail or clarifies some things. And then you have a new prophecy, and then the same thing happens. God comes in and expands on or gives more detail. That's all that's happening here. Because we are now focusing in on this new information that he saw in the last prophecy. Right, next slide. All right, so verse 25 here. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the Lord comes. All right, so the first thing here is you see it says the anointed one, comma, the ruler, comma. So now we know from verse 24, the most holy of holies or the most holy place is indeed a person. Okay, it's not, we're not talking about the temple, we're not talking about anything other than a person. And this person will be a ruler. Okay, so that you need to understand that piece here. Understand also that depending on your translation of the Bible, verse 25 will be read differently. I've provided some examples here. Some say that coming forth from that commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the prince, comes. The basic English version says, building again of Jerusalem until a prince on whom holy oil has been put on. The King James version says, going forth from the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the prince, comes. The reason why there are different translations here is because of the root words. So you have Messiah, which means anointed, anointed one, the Messiah, anointed by the vine, etc. Then you have Nagid, which means a leader, a ruler, a prince, and a king. And then you have a combination of words, which is the bar and Mosa, which means a decree and order, a command, to put out instruction, etc. All right, so all that really matters here is there's going to be a command given from one of these Gentile kings, which would have to have the power to issue that command, right? That will allow the Jews to go back and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Because once again, the city has been destroyed, it's been ransacked, the temple has been destroyed. All that happened at the beginning of the exile. Okay? Take us to the next slide. So from that point, when the command is given, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and trench, but in times of trouble. Right? So you have a period of 7 years. And then 62 times 7 years. So if you do the math, it's 483 years. So what Gabriel is saying is from the moment the decree is given to go home and rebuild Jerusalem until he's about to get to it in the next verse, there's going to be a period of 483 years. Okay? And then he talks about 2 events here that's going to happen. So at the end of that 483 years, the anointed one, the ruler, will come, which is the Messiah. It is Jesus. And then during that time, Jerusalem will be rebuilt. We'll have a trench, we'll have streets, etc. But that whole time is going to be a troubling time. Okay, so my version of it is Daniel, pay attention to what I'm going to say. From the moment the order is given to rebuild Jerusalem for the next 483 years, it will be rebuilt with the streets and even entrenched during troubling times. Don't worry though, because at the end of the 483 years, the Messiah is coming.
I just want to only they put a trench. Is that like a moat, or is there any explanation that you come across that?
Mine translates it moat.
Okay, so because it said in time patrol, I was thinking maybe that was a security trench.
And also, we'll get to it probably next week when we break this timeline down even more. But in Ezra and in Nehemiah, they both talk about different orders coming out for the Jews to go back and either rebuild the temple or rebuild the city. And I think it was in Ezra, correct me if I'm wrong, but King Artaxerxes is being advised by his advisors, and they're telling them not to. Because he's saying if you let these Jews go home, they're going to fortify Jerusalem, and they're going to gain in power, and they're going to be a threat to our kingdom. Okay, so that's exactly what happened. Like the Jews, not that they were a threat to that kingdom, but they went home and they're like, we aren't going to be as easily conquered next time. We're going to fortify the living cat out of Jerusalem. We're going to build big walls, we're going to build big gates. We're going to make it harder to defeat.
And I think the key here is the decree to rebuild the city comes after the decree to rebuild the temple. So it's key, it's the decree to rebuild the city, including the wall. And what we read in Nehemiah, that's what Nehemiah all about.
I'll be covering that next week. Yeah. All right, so take this to the next slide. All right, then it says, Brady, question.
Where are we at to this step? Because you said, because you like thinking that the Messiah is coming during or slightly after your lifetime, and it says that he's coming after the
Okay, so we'll be covering it next week for sure. But basically, the way this happens is, so the decree is given, right, for the Jews who are in exile to go home and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. That's what we're talking about here. Then it says 483 years, the anointed one, which is the Messiah, will come. Okay, so we're in the 400s-ish BC, right? And I'll cover it next week when we talk specifically about the timeline. But the Messiah comes in 33 AD, right? And then here it says right there, after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. Okay? And we're going to cover it. So just stay tuned and you'll see what I'm saying. Basically, what happens is you have a 490-year prophecy. 483 years brings us to the Messiah. But then the Messiah gets killed, right? We all know that. Jesus comes in on the 10th of Nisan, the same day that the Jews are selecting their sacrificial lambs. He rides into Jerusalem, presenting himself as the ultimate sacrificial lamb. And then he dies for that Passover, which once again, the Passover, what were we celebrating? We're celebrating how the blood of the lamb around the doorway saves those who believe in the power of that blood from the death that God is going to bring to the Egyptians, right? That's the holiday of the Passover, which is why they're sacrificing the lamb, and they got to select it on the 10th of Nisan. So Jesus comes in and dies to serve as that sacrifice. That's 483 years. But then there's 7 years remaining, right? Well, that 7 years is the tribulation period, which we're going to get to. So where are we? Well, Jesus has died, so we're after the 483 years. But we're still here, right? Is there still sin? Yes. Has Jerusalem had all their prophecies finally restored and fulfilled? No. So we are between the 483 years and the beginning of the final 7 years, which is known as the church age, which is known as the time of the Gentiles, which is known as the age of grace. Okay, and it's because the Jews rejected the Messiah. So God, imagine you have this clock. The decree gets ordered, right? He starts the clock, and it's a countdown clock. And that countdown has 490 years. Okay, at the end of that, when all the time runs out, sin will be ended, wickedness will be atoned for, and everlasting righteousness will be in place, right? However, the second Jesus Christ is nailed to that cross, what does God do? He hits the stop button on the clock. So now there's 7 years remaining on that clock. He's not going to start it again, and we'll cover it until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. What will happen is, whenever that is deemed as appropriate by God, and only the Father knows, Jesus Christ himself said it in Mark, that only the Father knows. No man, not even himself, he was acknowledging that he himself didn't know at that time, didn't know when the time would be fulfilled, right? Only the Father knows. So when God is ready, he's going to send Jesus back. The rapture will happen. If we're dead, we will be risen and given a glorified body. We will meet our Savior up in the sky, up in the clouds. If we're alive, we will be snatched up. We'll be given a glorified body. We will meet our Savior in the sky, right? Then we're going to leave. And then the tribulation period kicks off. Because the tribulation period is a period of wrath, which isn't for us. It's for the Jews and all those that aren't saved. And then at the end of the tribulation period, that's when the second coming of Christ happens. When he comes back and he gets rid of the Antichrist and he sets up a millennial kingdom. So right now we are in between year 483, the prophecy, and year 484, the prophecy.
This pause in this prophetic timeline. If you join us on Wednesday night, we're going through the book of Romans. We're going to deal with this extensively. What is the time of the Gentiles, and why do we have a time of the Gentiles? And what of the Jews in the meantime? Remember, this prophecy is given to Daniel and his people. That's what it said, the Jews. This is a prophecy to the Jewish nation. So it's only concerning the Jews. When the Jews refused Jesus the first coming, when they refused to acknowledge him as their Messiah, what we're taught by Paul in the book of Romans is that God has set them aside while he pulls out a people for himself from the Gentiles. That's what's known as the church age, or the age of grace. When the full number, when the full complement, it's a naval term that Paul uses, when the full number that God has chosen to be his church has finally accepted Jesus, then the church's purpose is complete. And we'll get into that purpose in the book of Romans. Then God once again turns his attention back to dealing with the Jews. So we're in that pause where God has said, okay, you refuse my Messiah. I'm just going to set you aside for a few years. I'm going to deal with the Gentiles and pull out a people for myself and the Gentiles.
Does it mention anywhere what's gonna happen to like the world and birth, like after that all happens?
Yeah, book of Revelation is all about it.
I'll be covering it too at the end of Daniel. Because when we get into 10, 11, and 12,
Daniel.
the next 3 chapters, those 3 chapters mirror greatly Revelation, except without all the symbolic metaphors and things that are happening in Revelation. Because Revelation we talk about the woman and the dragon and the 4 horses, it's very symbolically heavy. Whereas 10, 11, and 12 teach the same things, most of the same things, without the symbolism. And I'll draw the lines of parallel and we'll hash that out. That'll begin right after this chapter. All right, so it says here that the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. So when we look at the different translations, some say he will be cut off, but not for himself. Some will say that he will be killed, appearing to have accomplished nothing. Why are there differences in our translations? And the reason why there are differences in our translations is because of the Hebrew root words. So I have them here. You have roth, which means to be cut off, cut down, cease, destroy, perish, etc. Then you have a combination of words, which is lo and ayin, which together means a lack of completeness, to have no peace, to gain nothing, to have no benefit, etc. So what it's saying here is after the 62 sevens, after the 483 total years, the anointed one, the Messiah, he will come, but then he's going to be immediately killed, and it will appear that he accomplished nothing. That's what it's saying. And we know that that's true, right? What happened to Jesus Christ? Everyone thought that the Messiah was going to come, and when he came, he was going to be a warrior, and he would remove the suppression of the Jewish people, and he would defeat the Roman Empire, and that Jerusalem would finally be restored in purity, and that eventually they would conquer all the lands of Judea, and they would have all the land that was promised to them from God to Abraham, and like, it would be this everlasting kingdom, right? And like, this Messiah would sit on David's throne, and all these promises would be fulfilled. But what happens is God sends Jesus, and Jesus doesn't do most of those things right away, right? Because it's a split prophecy. All those things will be fulfilled on the second coming. So the Messiah comes, they say, you're not the Messiah, you're blaspheming, you're a false teacher, and we're gonna kill you according to the law of Moses. So then they kill him. And then everyone's like, well, that was pointless. What happened? Like, he said he was the Messiah, we killed him, and he's clearly dead. It appears he didn't do anything. That's what this is prophesying. Okay, next slide. Then it says here, the people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. Right? So Gabriel is letting Daniel know that the city will be once again destroyed. That the temple, which hasn't even been rebuilt yet, will once again be destroyed. Okay, he's foreshadowing what's going to happen after this anointed one, Messiah, dies. Okay, history has shown us that the Romans are the ones who destroyed Jerusalem. They're the ones that destroyed the second temple. And we know that that happened in the year 70 AD. Jesus himself prophesied that that would happen. And we're going to cover it in the next slide. So who is this ruler who will come? Well, we know that this ruler who will come, his people are the ones that destroy the city and the sanctuary. Well, we know that the Romans destroyed the city and the sanctuary. So that means that the Antichrist will be from the Romans. But we know that the Antichrist isn't come yet, right? Think back to chapter 2, when I described how the iron legs represent the Roman Empire, but then the feet of partially baked clay and iron represent the restored Roman Empire, right? And I said the Antichrist would come from that. Same thing in beast 4. Beast 4 represented the Roman Empire, but the head with the 10 horns and little horn, which represented the Antichrist, represented the future restored Roman Empire. So that's why it's saying the ruler who will come, his people will destroy this, because his people are the Roman Empire. Okay? And similarly, the Antichrist, which is the ruler who will come, his people will be part of this 10-nation confederation, which will be this new restored Roman Empire in the future. Does that make sense, or did I lose any of you? Okay. Next slide. And then it says here, okay, so this is Matthew 24. You could read the whole chapter. We don't have time. It's 51 verses. I'm just going to cover the cliff notes here. All right. I highly encourage you to read 24 yourself. All right. So Jesus also predicts the destruction of the city and the temple in verse 2. And then immediately after that, Jesus transitions from those events to the events that will happen in the future. And this is because the events of 70 AD foreshadow the tribulation period. Just as Antiochus in many ways foreshadowed the Antichrist in the tribulation period, so will Roman General Titus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD foreshadow the events of the tribulation period. We know in the tribulation period that many armies will fall down onto Jerusalem. We know that the Jews will be stripped of their religion, they won't be able to practice freely. We know that they're going to be put to death, and they're going to be forced to either take on the mark of the beast, or they're going to be faced with execution. We know all these things. Okay, so that's why when Jesus looks back to the temple and he says, I promise you every single one of these stones will not be left unturned, and then immediately goes off on a tangent about the end times, it's because those two events are so similar. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the tribulation period are so similar, it sets them off on that split prophecy. Okay?
Even to the person of Titus, because Vespasian starts the war, right? Then he becomes emperor, and so he leaves his son to complete the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's why he is called the Antichrist. He is Satan's attempt to mimic the Godhead. Right? So he sends his son, the Antichrist. Satan sends his son, the Antichrist, to do it.
Absolutely. All right, and then in verse 15 of chapter 24, Jesus specifically mentions Daniel's prophecy and the Son of Man usage. Okay. In verses 16 and 22, he talks about how bad the time will be, and then in verses 23 through 31, he warns about not following false prophets or the Antichrist, and then he also hints at how he, the Messiah, will return. And it says there that he'll come from the east, and even those in the west will be able to see it, and etc. Right? Okay. I put this in there because even Jesus himself foreshadows the events of 70
All right, Christian has a question. Let me pull it back up here. When we say that the Antichrist comes from a restored Roman Empire, does that mean the Antichrist will come from Western Europe, or does it mean that the government will mirror Rome? Any Western nation could have the Antichrist, which means the Antichrist can come from America.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. So it doesn't mean that the Antichrist will be Italian.
No, it's
Because-
somewhere within
this-
the original Roman Empire.
Yes.
And what Christian's point there is that we, the Western democracies, share that heritage, right? They owned England. England was a Roman Empire, where English taught. So we have that heritage as part of the old Roman Empire as well. Yes.
When we talk about the Roman Empire, are we talking about like at its complete height? The coverage of that, or just,
At the time of the destruction of the temple,
okay,
All right, next slide.
which was,
Next slide. Okay, and then it says here that the end will come like a flood, nor will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. So Gabriel's letting Daniel know that the end will come on suddenly like a flood, and that all of this has already been essentially decreed by God. Okay, the Romans came on to Jerusalem in 70 AD under General Titus with such a force and overwhelming power that this warning come like a flood is a very accurate portrayal of what would come to the people of Jerusalem in 70 AD. All right, but it's also true to what's going to happen in the tribulation period. Okay. And then it says, war will continue until the end, and desolations will have been decreed. So Gabriel is warning Daniel that even after the fall of Jerusalem, all the way up until the end times, that the people are going to face war, trials, tribulations, trouble, etc., because this has already been decreed by God. And then Jesus had a very similar message that's captured in Luke chapter 21, verses 20 to 24, which we're going to cover. It's similar to the passage in Matthew, just a little bit more condensed. Take us to the next slide. So when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Okay? Keyword there, armies. So what is Jesus talking about? This isn't talking about General Titus destroying the temple. Remember, he talks about that and then immediately changes gears and talks about the tribulation period and the end times. That's what he's describing here. He's talking about this 10-nation army, all these different armies, plural, coming down onto Jerusalem in support of the Antichrist. Okay? Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. Once again, the wrath of the tribulation period has been decreed to all the prophets. Well, not all of them, but many of the prophets for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay? How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So that's what I was saying right now. So right now, we are in the time of the Gentiles. So from that moment on, Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until that time has been fulfilled, which is true. The Jews didn't even get Israel back as a country until the 40s. And even now, they still don't have all of the land. The city of Jerusalem, where the temple was, there's currently an Islamic mosque. It's called the Dome of the Rock. Like they're still being trampled today. Okay. Take us to the next slide. So let's get back on track here. All right, so when we combine all that together, let's look at my version now, because I just broke down like each little piece of that verse. So after the 483 years, the Messiah will be put to death shortly after he comes, and it will appear he died for nothing. The Romans will come in with such a great force, it will be as if a flood hit Jerusalem. The city and the second temple will be destroyed. War, trials, and tribulations will continue all the way up until the end. All right, take us to the next slide. So now it says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. So the he that he's talking about here, because this immediately proceeds the ruler who will come, right? The ruler who will come is the Antichrist. At this point in the prophecy, Jesus Christ is already dead. Remember, after the 483 years, the anointed one will come, will be put to death, and will period accomplish nothing. So this he is not Jesus Christ. This he that we're talking about is the Antichrist. Some Christians get this wrong. And some Christians that are post-millennial brothers and the ones that don't really believe in the rapture, they get this verse wrong here. And they think that they're talking about Jesus Christ making a covenant. It's not what's happening. Okay? What's happening is the Antichrist will make a covenant with the people of Israel for 7 years. That's what that's saying. Okay? And the reason for that is you have to look at all the context. The he here is talking about the ruler who will come, which we talked about is the Antichrist. At this point in the prophecy, the Messiah is already dead.
Yeah, I mean, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, they all end speaking about the Antichrist.
Exactly. All right, so next slide. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to the sacrifice and the offering. So basically, after 3.5 years, the Antichrist is going to go against this covenant that he makes with the Jewish people, and he's going to put an end to the sacrifice. Okay? This is the same thing that we talked about, like Jeff just said in chapter 7, and John speaks about it in Revelation, as well in chapter 11, chapter 12, repeatedly, and even chapter 13. All right, so in chapter 7, Daniel calls this a times, and half a time. We already covered this weeks ago. It's 3.5 years. John will call this either 1,260 days or 42 months. All these prophecies are talking about the same thing.
Don't do the math and get confused. They use the 360-day calendar, not 365.
Which I'll be showing next week.
Yeah.
When we break this timeline
Somebody
down.
will take them numbers. Wait a minute.
Yeah,
it's
really
360 days.
All right, so all that you need to know now is the Antichrist comes in the scene. He's like, hey, Jewish people, you're my friend. I'm going to make a 7-year pact with you. I'm going to let you rebuild the temple. I'm going to let you get back to worshiping. And the Jews are going to be cool with it. And then halfway through that, he's going to put an end to that agreement. And he's immediately going to put an end to their sacrifice. He's going to start the persecution of them. He's going to start the execution of them. And that's when he's going to implement the mark of the beast. Okay? Next slide. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on it. So once again, halfway through that tribulation period, he goes back on his word. He starts this persecution of the Jewish people, and then he's going to set up an abomination that causes desolation within the temple. In the same way that we learned about in chapter 8, right? Chapter 8, and Antiochus Epiphanes, how he set up an abomination of desolation in the temple. He basically erected an altar for Zeus, and he sacrificed pigs, and he had the blood, and he was pouring the blood all over, and he was making the Jews eat the pigs, which is an unclean animal, and like, he was burning all the Mosaic texts and the law, and he wasn't letting anyone practice it, and he was converting all these people to his pagan religion. In the same way that Antiochus Epiphanes does that, the Antichrist is going to do it, just on a whole nother level. Okay, on an end of times level, apocalyptic level. Okay, that's what we're talking about here in that underlying portion. So my version of verse 27 is the Antichrist will make a 7-year pact with the people. They will be deceived because after 3.5 years, he breaks this covenant and will put an end to sacrifice, religious offerings, and other religious practices. The Antichrist will desecrate the temple and oppress the holy people in such a way it will be considered an abomination that causes desolation. And this will continue until he meets his end that has already been predetermined by God and has been revealed to you before Daniel.
And that abomination that causes desolation of the Antichrist is actually him setting up a statue of himself in the temple of God, the rebuilt temple of God, and demanding to be worshipped as God.
Here's the next slide, and then this is. So when we take all those 4 verses that I wrote down in my version, right, and we talk about the original language and what it means, when we put it all together, that's what we have. I'm not going to read it all. You guys can read it if you want, but basically what he's saying is there's 490 years. At the end of this, sin will finally be ended, wickedness will be atoned for, everlasting righteousness will be brought in. Right? 490 years. And then he says, 483 years after the decree to go back out and rebuild the city is given, the Messiah is going to come. Right after that, he's going to be put to death, and everyone's going to think he accomplished nothing. Okay? And then it says the Antichrist will come, because now we fast forward to the last 7 years, who will make a pact with the people for 7 years, but then halfway through, he's going to go against that pact. He's going to put an end to Jewish religion. He's going to issue out the mark of the beast. He's going to create the abomination of desolation in the temple. And all that will continue until the end that has been already determined by God is poured out, which we know is when the Messiah comes back the second time and defeats the Antichrist and throws him in to the lake of fire. Okay, that's what that prophecy is. So now next week, take us to the next slide just first and talk about it for just a second. So this is what it visually, this is what it looks like. Okay, you have a 490-year prophecy. Numerically, it's broken up into 3 different ways, but it realistically is 2 different ways. You have a 483-year period and then a 7-year period. Okay, so I hope this visualizes it, but the key takeaway is at the end of all of it, those things in the upper right-hand corner will happen. Okay, so starting next week, we're going to look at this, but we're going to break it down even more. Because we're going to talk about, well, what decree was given? How do we know which decree to start the clock at? Right? We're going to look at a couple different ones. And then I'm going to give you the exact date for that decree. And then we're going to take the 483 years, and we're going to fast forward it. And we're going to find out that that prophecy, when we do the math, and I'll show you, predicts the exact day that Jesus Christ rode the donkey into Jerusalem. We know the exact day. So from the day that Artaxerxes gives that command, 173,880 days later, Jesus Christ rode a donkey into Jerusalem.
And interestingly, it is the first time he allows himself to be publicly declared the Messiah. That's what's going on when the Pharisees say, hey, tell your people to stop saying you're the Messiah. And he says, I tell you the truth, if they don't do it, the rocks will cry out. Why? Because God told Daniel, I'm showing up this day.
Yeah. So that's the meat and potatoes of the prophecies. Next week, we're going to build a timeline. We're going to look at it in more detail. I'm going to give you all those numbers and to show you how I figured out the dates for everything. And then as we do it, we'll build a timeline, and by the end of it, you'll see a whole prophecy on a timeline with everything. Okay, and then that'll finish chapter 9. All right. Let me infer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this. I thank you and praise you for the opportunity to teach. And I pray that this class is beneficial to all. I pray that it helps them understand that history is ultimately your story, Lord. And all this has been already predetermined by you, has already been written, has already been seen. I pray that all those in this world that are lost will see your word and ultimately come to know that the Messiah has truly come. That Jesus Christ was the Messiah, that everyone at the time of his crucifixion should have already known that the Messiah was going to come on that exact day. Lord, I pray that all those that are lost will ultimately find their Savior in Christ, that they will ultimately be justified by you, and that they will ultimately be saved by your grace. And I pray all this in the matchless name of Jesus Christ. Amen.